Hello teachers, today we will be looking into class 45 of the V2 curriculum, Introduction to Angles and Speed. The students will be introduced to angles, speed and slider and learn how to build a dart game based on these concepts. The goal of the class would be to understand what an angle is, what a slider is, what a speed is and build a dart game. So to begin with, there are some visual aid slides given for the class. So after revising the previous class, the trash sorter game was the previous class, so you can just ask few questions related to the previous class, and once the revision part is done, we can move on to today's activity. So as mentioned, it's introduction to angles and speed. So there's a boy here who wants to fly his rocket, but he's unable to do so. So that's when his father steps in and helps him to explain what angle and speed is. So when you explain to the kids, you can try giving some real examples and try to make the story as interesting as possible so that the students grasp the concepts. So here the boy tells his father that the rocket is not flying. So the father tells him, "Let me teach you how to use a controller. Adjust the slider on the controller." So here in your dart game also you have certain game elements like your slider. So let's see how the story blends with our activity. So use the slider to set the direction of the rocket. Let's adjust the angle. So here is the word. Okay, so what is an angle? So when the father presses the controller, the rocket moves upwards. Let me tell you more about angles. So when the rocket faces east, the angle is 0. So when he is moving the slider, so that's when the rocket faces east, okay, 0 degree. Now when the rocket faces south, the angle is 90. South 90. Similarly, west 180 and north 270. So when the rocket comes back to its starting position, the angle is 360. So we can just try and give them real life example of a clock also to explain the angle. So you can also use a paint app to show them how it works. Now how does the rocket move? So just by giving the direction alone, the sprite will not move, right? So you need another component which is called as a speed. So you can give them an example of a car. Just by moving the steering wheel in any direction, the car won't move. So pressing the accelerator is equally important. So speed is used to make the rocket move. To set the speed, press the plus or the minus button. So the plus button will increase the speed, whereas the minus button will decrease the speed. So when the red button is pressed, the rocket will fly. So finally, when you press the red button, it will make the rocket fly. So now here comes the dart game, that is your today's activity. So we can just start with the game demo here. So let the students respond. Ask them what are the different game elements they see in the game. So the different sprites. So we have a background, we have a dart, balloon, we have this text. So this is not a sprite, but it's a text. Then you have a angle label here. Then you have the slider, angle slider, and then a angle slider ball. So this angle here is also a sprite. So once the game elements are explained, we can move on to the designing part. So in teacher activity 2, we need to create the angle. So this particular activity, this creation of the angle, scaling it and setting the animation is done in teacher activity 2. So this is your sprite angle. Then moving on to student activity 1. In student activity 1, the student would design the angle slider and the angle slider ball. So what is an angle slider? Angle slider is this line. Okay, so this is how the students, okay, these two are covered in student activity 1. So creation of the angle slider, setting animation, and then the angle slider ball. So if you notice here, the angle slider ball's y coordinate is 380. So this is something very important which will be explained later on. Now moving on to the slide. So here, what are your challenges? So we need to explain to them once the game part, explaining the game elements are done. So here we are going to start with explaining the angle slider and why is it used. Okay. So just like how the controller, okay, the slider was used to control the movement of the rocket here in the left hand side. Similarly, the angle slider here will help me move the dart in whichever direction I want. Sprite dot rotation command. So sprite dot rotation command in your sprites option. So what it does is it's going to set the rotation. Okay, it gives a rotation to your sprite. So now here, whatever angle you give here, your dart will rotate in that particular direction. So if you give it 0, it's east, 90 south. So as previously mentioned, okay, so once you give it as 180, it will be west, and 270 northwards. So by giving the direction, you can control the movement of your sprite into the direction. Now how are we going to use the sprite dot rotation command in our dart game? So if we notice here, if mouse pressed over angle slider. So when I press my mouse over angle slider, the angle slider ball's y coordinate is going to be the same as my mouse's y coordinate. So if my mouse is here, the ball is going to come exactly where my mouse is placed. Okay, so this is how the movement of the ball is done. Now here, when mouse is pressed over AS, the dart dot rotation block equal to 380 minus ASB dot y. So now why is it 380? That's because your ball, okay, your angle slider ball, it starts with 380. The y position, as mentioned earlier, the y position of your angle slider ball is 380. Okay, it starts from here. There is a 20 pixel gap from the bottom edge. So here, if I place my angle slider ball at 290, okay, if the y position is 290, that means we are going to do 380 minus 290, which will give me 90 degrees. So that's why the dart is facing southwards. Similarly, it works for the other angles as well. So if the slider ball is placed at 200, it's going to be 380 minus 200, which will give me 180. So your dart will face westwards. So that's how the calculation part is done, 380 minus the ASB dot y. Now comes the next block, which is called as dart dot set speed and direction. So as mentioned earlier, just by giving a direction, the sprite will not move. You also need to set the speed. So here in this block, the first parameter you need to give is the speed and then the direction. The higher the value you give here, the higher would be the speed. So here, as you see, the speed set is 4 and we are going to keep the dart dot rotation block. So in place of direction, we are going to keep the dart dot rotation block. So whatever value is stored in this, it will get shown here. So see, if you notice here, when the speed was 4, the dart was moving slowly, and once the speed is set to 10, it moves at a higher speed. The direction remains the same. So that was about the next set of slides. Now coming to teacher activity 3. In teacher activity 3, you need to show the slider functionality. So here, once this part is explained, like if mouse, when you move your mouse over the angle slider, when your mouse is pressed over the dart, once all this part is done. So now what happens when the dart touches the balloon? So that's another event which we need to do. So condition. So if your dart is touching the balloon. So when I click on the dart, so if mouse is pressed over the dart starts moving in that particular direction with that speed. And what happens once the dart is touching the balloon? We are going to stop the dart. So we are going to set it to 0, 0. And the balloon's x and y position is going to be random number. So we are going to place the balloon in random position between 100 to 350. So every time when the dart touches the balloon will move to random position. And then moving on, we can give them some extra information, like how the second hand moving from one point to the other makes an angle. So we can end the class by telling them, in your next class we will be we'll be showing you how to create a stopwatch. So this is how you would explain, like, why a stopwatch is used and what's the purpose of a stopwatch. Then comes the project part, wherein you give some project pointer. Here, can you help Johnny and his sister get a few apples using an arrow? So here, instead of a dart, you have an arrow. Instead of a balloon, you have an apple. Okay, everything else remains the same. The angle slider ball, the angle slider. Okay, the slider ball is used to control the direction of the arrow. All the part remains the same. And then, if there is more time, okay, if you have some time left in your class, you can go for the additional activity, wherein you can add some confetti effects. So if you see here in your teacher activity, additional activity, so once let's see how to add the confetti effect. See, you see these effects, right? So that's something additional which you can do if you have time. So if counter equal to 0, equal to 100 and hit equal to true. So counter is something which you need to create. Okay, so you have a variable counter. So the dart visible equal to 1, the balloon's visibility is 1, confetti visibility 0, and it becomes false. So the main part which we need to cover here, okay, so before that confetti, you also need to make sure you create the sprite confetti. Okay, so in your animation tab you will have those animation for the confetti. So after all this is done, and then you move on to the additional part. So the main blocks to cover here in this class is the sprite.rotation block, set speed and direction block. So these needs to be stressed on a little bit more so that the students understand why these blocks are used. So once the project part has also been discussed with the students, you can end the class. Thank you.